One of the things that really affects the shape and position of your coastline is how much sediment is getting delivered there or is eroding away. And as I'm sure many people there are aware, that changes over time. Even within human lifetimes, you can see some big changes depending on how much mud is coming out of the rivers, how it's getting transported along. And so there's already a lot of variability in that system that creates for a very dynamic coastline in that region. Places with low-lying topography are particularly vulnerable to sea level rise as that occurs. Places that are already vulnerable are getting flooded, right, will be flooded more frequently. And so as the background level of sea level goes up, you're getting an increasing frequency of these high flooding events, if you will, that will affect the communities. And that's really how it's going to be felt. More than a gradual change will be those extreme events that become even more extreme and more frequent.
When we think about ecosystems, we often imagine pristine places deep within the hinterland region, far away from our urban cities. But right along our coastline is a constantly changing and dynamic ecosystem that has for thousands of years gone through transformative cycles that in one way or another can drastically affect the lives of those who call the coast their home. Guyana's coastline is just one part of a larger ecosystem that stretches all the way from the mouth of the Amazon in Brazil to the Orinoco in Venezuela. These mighty rivers play important roles in pushing massive, mineral-rich mud banks along the Guyanese coast from east to west, like a giant, wet conveyor belt. The abundance or scarcity of these mud deposits is subject to an ebb and flow cycle lasting approximately 30 years. It is estimated that roughly 3 times per century, the coastline is subjected to severe periods of mud scarcity and erosion, which allow high tides to penetrate further inland. These periods of erosion are followed by periods of accretion as the cycle continues. The cyclical erosion happening on Guyana's foreshores have the potential to displace natural sea defenses, such as mangrove forests, which are an ecosystem in itself. They act as a buffer, shielding the coast from intense wave action. However, over the years, we have seen a significant decrease in mangrove forests, leaving our coast directly exposed to wave impact. What's more is that temperatures around the world are rising. Ice and snow on distant mountains and ice sheets are melting at an increasing rate. This meltwater is discharged into our oceans. Global sea levels are predicted to rise between 1 and 4 feet by the end of this century. And with every millimeter, Guyana's border wall approaches a point of irreversible collapse. In the last few years, Guyana has witnessed and felt the physical effects of rising sea levels and overtopping. Coastal communities have felt this devastation as their open backyards have become one with the ocean. But what about when high tides aren't washing away our coastal plains? These harsh realities are only visible when we are directly affected, when in fact, we should be working to combat it every day. But with the collaborative effort of civil society and public institutions, we can combat the issue of rising sea levels and overtopping and become the guardians of our coastal communities.
His main focus is to continue to create content for Guyanese audience so that we can collectively build different perspectives on Guyana as we move forward. He's particularly keen on engaging and sharing the present and the future of the younger generation. He's tackled some budgets recently, and he's here to show us some of those physical effects on climate change. Alex?
All right, thank you for that introduction. Good night, everybody. It's an honor to be here. My first experience with overtopping and sea level rise was when my mom convinced me to go to Jamaica. One of the places up the East Coast that has in my opinion, one of the more sturdy seawall structures. They had a massive high tide, so we're like, okay, we gotta go film this. Essentially, this is what happened. This doesn't only happen in one part of the coast. Right outside in Kitty, outside the Russian embassy. This is where the majority of Guyanese are. And look at the kind of overtopping that we experience right outside our capital city. This happens all over. This is in Buxton as well. You actually hear those waves crashing into the wall, and it's a very surreal feeling of vulnerability, which I think that a lot of people aren't very aware of. If we look at old cokers and sluices, that's where we were. You know, that was where the seawall once was. Look at where we are now. But more recently, there's been severe overtopping in other locations, particularly on the west bank of Demerara. Below the seawall is essentially a bowl that is just waiting to be filled. And once water gets in there, it's not that easy to get out. When that water starts to pour in, we're basically sitting ducks, helpless. The overtopping is one thing, but once that water gets in, all hell breaks loose. There were latrines around the area that were flooded. Now that water mixes with trench water and sewage and everything else. This is also a major health risk that we really need to consider when we talk about overtopping. We can go as far as the northwest. Take the Shell Beach Protected Area, for example. Encompassing 120 kilometers of beaches and mudflats, as well as Guyana's largest and most intact mangrove forests, the Shell Beach Protected Area possesses an array of rich coastal ecosystems. It is primarily known as a nesting site for 4 species of marine turtles. Located in the far northwest of Guyana, Shell Beach is one of the country's most unique protected areas. However, being a protected area alone does not guarantee protection from the detriments of erosion. The entire area, which sits between 1 and 25 meters above sea level, has experienced dramatic changes in recent years. Satellite data has revealed a regression of up to 1,100 meters in some sections of the coastline, whereas seawater has protruded into many other parts of the community. Rising sea levels due to climate change, coupled with cyclical erosion, have caused the beaches which characterize this landscape to disappear further and further into the ocean. As the pristine coastlines of Shell Beach quietly vanish, the role of environmental activists and conservationists have become particularly crucial. You have been involved with the Shell Beach Protected Area for the past roughly 30 years. So, you definitely have an understanding of the coastal effects of sea level rise and tidal wave action. What can you tell us about that?
When I was out there living with the Ammon Beach community, they were a thriving community of 280 persons, and all of their infrastructure, the school, the health hut, the teachers' quarters, were in the middle of a thriving, wide coconut plantation. What happened in terms of changes to that particular area and its coastline was in 2012, we started to see the waves getting stronger, the wind also getting stronger, and the waves becoming higher and higher, where they were overtopping the beach and slowly but surely eroding the strands of coconut plants that were there. So one line of coconut trees went into the sea, then a second line, a third line, until it was literally at the door of the school, the health hut, and the teachers' quarters. It was only a matter of time, within like 3 years, where the community had to basically relocate to higher ground. In some cases, some persons moved to Mabruma, and presently, today, in 2020, there are barely 36 persons remaining. In a sense, these would have been my earliest experience with what were, in fact, climate refugees. What was very sad about that, though, for me personally, is these families that I'd spent 3 decades with, who had been practicing fishing and farming out at Ammon Beach as part of their traditional livelihoods, no longer had that arable land available when they were located in Mabruma. They no longer had easy access to fishing. So they were now forced to change their entire lifestyle and to go and look for jobs wherever they were fortunate to actually find it.
A key part of our nation's patrimony and an important site for wildlife and tourism has slowly disappeared beneath the waves. In this instance, the loss of infrastructure and farmlands and the disruption to traditional cultures and livelihoods are directly attributable to rising sea levels and severe cycles of erosion. The events at Shell Beach are nothing short of a tragedy and a warning of the threat we face all along our coast. It's easy to look at places like Shell Beach and imagine a different ocean compared to the calm and placid sea right here at our doorsteps. However, we cannot afford to be complacent about overtopping any longer. Our richest agricultural lands and main urban centers are virtually unprotected from the inevitable. And when we mix rising sea levels with periodic erosion, the scale of disaster is hard to imagine. The verdant plains on our eastern coast represent what it means to be Guyanese. These fertile landscapes are the backbone of our agricultural sector. But even these iconic fields can soon come under immense threat. The intrusion of seawater can spell disaster for agricultural crops. Salting the soil draws moisture down from the plants, shriveling their leaves and then rotting them at the root. lush fields are soon turned to slushy, dead mudflats. On this dynamic coastline, the forces of erosion are evident, weakening the barriers separating land from the sea. One minor breach, and the whole crop is lost. An initial flood like this can cost farmers millions of dollars, and millions of taxpayer dollars more in infrastructure. But with a spring tide still to come, this destruction may only be the tip of the iceberg. Their giant mechanical arms moving with precision, excavators are the first on the scene. They rearrange tons of earth and riprap in order to reinforce the crumbling sea defenses. Next, a road must now be constructed. Larger machinery is needed at the seawall if the workers are to be able to shore up the defenses. Sand is laid to reinforce the ground and facilitate movement. With the access road created, workers can begin the task of channeling water back into the ocean. But with the sea defenses still not completed and the tide still rising, the futility of this exercise will soon become apparent. The dam created along the access road seems to hold for now. But the flooding is getting more and more severe. The road now sits in a critical zone, with the only barrier protecting it under immense stress from thousands of cubic meters of seawater that have infiltrated the area. The fight is still not over, and with the spring tide on the way, more tugs and barges of riprap are brought to the breach. On land, 11 excavators are now working simultaneously along a 3-kilometer stretch of coastland. Rising waves are closing in on the workers, providing challenging conditions to bring materials on shore from the barge. If they stick around a moment too long, an operation of this magnitude can easily be their last.
I never see thing like this.
We never got flood like this with the salt water.
And I just then looking at this water all the time. I say, Father God, only you could call.
We lost about 10 acre rice and everything dug up in water. So I got nothing, just milk cow and sell. Me not got nothing now for do, nothing, me up.
You can't stay here.
If they relocate us where to and under what, because remember, some people just depend on livestock, some people depend on rice farming. Where would they push their head to go and where would they plant?
Where me pray for that the water go down for let me animal then survive.
I got a couple cows. Some of them must be dead in there.
Our rice land is underwater, so we can plant rice about 2 to 3 crops now. Poultry farming, dog, sheep in our garden and everything gone now.
I mean, this is a natural disaster, but then at the same time, we have to deal with it.
I know what happened there.
It is hard not to be moved by the stories of Guyanese who've lost everything to climate change in recent times. And my experiences filming the vulnerability of our coastland has left me looking for answers. So I reached out to Andrea Dutton, renowned geoscientist and sea level rise expert.
I'm glad you're doing this work. The imagery really lends itself to a story in the way that kind of the heating of our atmosphere does not. Sea level rise is a very visual and tangible effect that people can connect with. How are we going to protect our coastal community? Some people view it as, we'll just fight, it's always been here, I'm not going to give up my ground. But yet that's unreasonable because we know the coastline is going to change and it will retreat over time. So if we can reach an acceptance of that information, we can think about how do we want that to play out? Do we want to sit here and wait until the catastrophic things happen? Or do we want to make a choice about managing that retreat in some fashion? And that's very hard because usually people are reactive more than proactive.
Over the last 3 decades, our natural sea defenses have been severely weakened. More than 3/4 of our coastal mangrove forests have been lost, removing a key natural barrier in the fight against erosion. As a result, we have become more and more dependent on seawalls to keep us safe.
Seawalls, I think, are in a way a very scary solution because if you build a wall in one place, that water has to go somewhere. So if it's not getting in through that wall, it makes the flooding even worse somewhere else, at the end of that wall. And the other thing about building seawalls is I think it builds in complacency for the communities who live behind them because they feel like they've addressed the problem and they're safe, which actually makes them all the more vulnerable because at some point that wall will fail. And then they will not be prepared for it at all.
What I'm trying to do with this documentary is to, again, create awareness, but I don't want to be all doom and gloom, which is, it can easily be construed as that. So what is the silver lining in this?
So the best thing that everyone can do, whether you're a skeptic about this or not, is just to have conversations about it with other people. And it doesn't mean that you have to know all the answers, but I guarantee that every time you have a conversation about sea level rise or climate change, that you will learn something, maybe just about the other person. This is an opportunity for us to reinvent our relationship to the coastline. Yeah, that's not going to be easy, but the investment is definitely going to be worth it for me and my family and my community. What we want to do is stay ahead of that rising sea, right? And not to go under. And I think that's the perspective we need to have, is to use this information as empowering. It's an opportunity to build in new and more resilient ways and to create communities that can live with this dynamic coastline.
Despite our history of overtoppings, the urgency of this situation has only now become evident. We need to stop thinking of the threat as an abstract possibility, but instead recognize that for many, it is already a reality. Working together, we still have the power to live in harmony with our beautiful coastal ecosystems, but not if we fail to act. To keep our heads above the waves, the conversation must start now.